Okay, this might be a good time to start. So my name is Vivek Pandey. I'm an assistant professor of accounting at the Simon Business School here at University of Rochester. I'm excited you've decided to join this session. So what I'm going to talk about is something based on our own research. The topic of today's talk is partisan regulators and corporate America, which seems like a very timely and extremely important topic for all of us to understand. And this is going to be based on my joint work with my Rochester colleagues, again, Xingyu Shen, our excellent PhD student, and my colleague Joanna Wu. So if you think about the origins of this work and why this is so important to think about right now, and this is probably not a big surprise for people anymore, but there's a big partisan divide in the US. So if you think about what divides people more and you want to put them into different groups, party lines and the party you identify with becomes a very strong group that people identify with. And this sort of affinity towards your own party members and not liking members of the other party, that has only become stronger over time. So in a lot of different sort of these large surveys, when you ask people who identify with one party or the other, in the US, you have these two important and prominent parties. If you ask them what do they think about members of the other party, what jumps out very quickly is that there is this out-group mistrust. I belong to one group, and if you belong to a different group, that in itself shapes how I think about you and your behaviors. So people tend to rate members who identify with the opposite party, the party that they don't identify with, as more dishonest and more immoral. And of course, a lot of other adjectives as well. So there's this deep mistrust against opposite party members. Against this societal backdrop is what we are interested in, this one of the top financial regulators in the country, the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. Sometimes it has been called the top cop on the beat. So they're the ones who enforce federal securities laws in the US, right? So they have sort of these important goals, extremely important goals. So they play a very pivotal role in our economy. So they protect investors, maintain efficient and fair, orderly markets, and facilitate capital formation. So if you think about what is their stated mission, there does not appear to be any room for partisan politics. Their role is too important to get influenced by anything other than these stated goals. So the question we're trying to tackle in this research, me and my co-authors, is there is this financial regulator with big influence on how federal securities laws are enforced, which then has an effect on the economy as a whole, against the backdrop that the society is going through, which is this deep political polarization. So the question we want to ask is, does political partisanship affect SEC's investigative and enforcement activities? And I'm going to get to more specifics. What do we mean by that? But think of this as the role of SEC is to enforce federal securities laws. So they're basically trying to investigate, and then if found guilty, mete out penalties and punishments if somebody is convicted of financial misconduct. So loosely speaking. So if you think about the top leadership at the SEC, right? So the commissioners, there are 5 commissioners. They tend to have party affiliations. They're also politically appointed. The president appoints them, the Senate confirms them. And there is this sort of built-in rule within the structure of the SEC to try and avoid partisan influence in SEC's behavior, which is no more than 3 out of 5 commissioners may belong to the same party. But you probably already noticed 3 out of 5 is already a majority. And then once you go below the top leadership, those are not political appointees. So the enforcement staff members, they're not direct political appointees. But there's a chance that, if there are preferences at the top, think about what the top leadership wants. Do the rest of the staff fall in line to align their behavior according to the preferences at the top? What sometimes is called as the tone at the top percolates down. So to tackle this question, what we are going to predict and then try to test is that if this is the case, that if SEC's investigative and enforcement activities get influenced by partisan politics, then we predict that this should result in more intense regulatory actions against firms that are misaligned with the SEC. And again, this goes back to the idea, if you ask people in surveys, what do they think about members of the opposite party? There's this deep mistrust. So that's sort of one possible way to think about why we might observe this almost disproportionate behavior, the SEC, the financial regulator, behaving differently against firms based on their political ideology. So if the SEC has an ideology, if the firms have a political ideology, if there is a clash, if there is a mismatch, we are predicting that that will result in more intense regulatory actions meted out by the SEC against firms. So theoretically, we think of at least two possible channels why this might happen. So one is this sort of the psychological channel, right? So this deep mistrust that also comes out a lot in surveys, and there's a lot of evidence to show that that actually is a very tangible human behavior, this mistrust of outgroup members. So there could be greater suspicion of misconduct against misaligned firms. The other is sort of a more rational choice that the commissioners might take. So here's the idea. The idea is to show loyalty. Commissioners at the top, they are political appointees, so they've been appointed by politicians. By being harsher against firms that identify with the opposite party is a way to show loyalty to your own party. And that way you can gain political mileage within the party that appointed you. And maybe that'll have positive benefits in your own career later on. So we're going to try and explore these possibilities. So before diving deeper into the data, let me just give you a very brief preview of how we are going to do it, what are we going to find before we dive deeper into the data. So what we need really is a way to measure SEC's political leanings. So we're going to use the party affiliation of the commissioners, who are sort of these top leadership of the SEC. For firms, we are going to identify their political leaning using the CEO. So if the CEO personally contributes some money to one political party more than the other political party, we'll label that CEO as affiliated with that party. And there's a lot of research shows that as individuals, people tend to be very sticky, which means that their choices of which party they donate money to or which party they vote to doesn't change a lot over the years. And for a smaller sample, we'll also basically try and figure out the CEO's party based on voter registration records. So if you're registered with one political party, we will use that party to identify the CEO's party affiliation. So again, for both the SEC and the firm, we're going to look at the top leadership. Party of the top leadership to identify the party of the SEC, party of the CEO to identify the party of the firm. And if there is a misalignment, the SEC majority identifies with one party, but the firm identifies with a different party, we're going to call that a misalignment or a political misalignment. And we're going to correlate that misalignment with some of these at least two important SEC actions. One is the act of investigations, and the other is enforcement actions itself, which are sort of the result of the investigation. So here's what we find. So I'm going to run through this a little quickly because I also want to be able to show you some data. So what we're finding is that if you look at firms that are misaligned with the SEC politically versus other firms within the same industry during the same presidential administration or during the same SEC chair's tenure, so that we are not comparing firms across industries, we are not comparing firms across different political climates or different political administrations. Within the same administration, within the same industry, we're going to compare two firms, one that is misaligned with the SEC and one that is not. What we find is very striking. If you're a misaligned firm, you're more likely to get investigated by the SEC, even within your industry. So this is not some style that changes over time or things that are different across industries or firm characteristics that are unrelated to your partisan leaning that might be driving this behavior. Then when you get to the result of these investigations, these enforcement actions, there is more nuance there. So the likelihood of an enforcement action itself is no different between misaligned and other firms. However, and this is the interesting part, if there is an enforcement action, the penalties, the monetary penalties, dollars that have to be shelled out, those are harsher for misaligned firms than other firms. Going back to what explains this, we predict and find that This happens more often when the commissioners are more partisan, you know, commissioners that were appointed by a president who was from the same party as the commissioners' party at a time when the president's party also controlled the Senate. So, sort of all the pieces were in their favor. Those that get appointed during such times, we label them as more partisan than others. So, such commissioners, when there are more such commissioners at the SEC, this behavior is stronger. This behavior is also stronger when the commissioners are younger. The idea here being when you're early in your career or earlier in your career, what you do now has bigger effects on your career later on. So there is this career concern. You're more driven and you want to do more things to catch attention so that you can benefit your career in the long run. So we find this behavior seems to suggest that when there is more partisan individuals at the SEC, when they're also younger, this behavior is also stronger. Do they benefit from it? So we track their career outcomes for the commissioners and the staff members. So not just the top leadership now, even the staff who are going to engage in these investigations and recommend these enforcement actions to the commissioners, which may or may not get approved. So we find that there appears to be a benefit to doing this. Commissioners that oversee more partisan enforcements, when their SEC tenure ends, go on to take more leadership roles in both public and private sector. So they benefit from showing this loyalty to their own party through partisan behavior in SEC's enforcement activities. So that's the top leadership. You go down a level, and then you look at all the attorneys, and then again you find almost this reward for partisan enforcement. So offices where attorneys engage in more partisan enforcement, those attorneys are more likely to get promoted. So not just the top leadership, but even the staff who anticipates what the top leadership at the SEC wants and then acts accordingly benefits in their career. Then we see, are these firms any different in their tendency to who's going to engage in a misconduct and who's not? So basically the true root cause for initiating an investigation, and we find no difference. So if you're a misaligned firm or a non-misaligned firm, it doesn't matter. You both are equally likely to engage in a misconduct. So then this sort of raises this very important question, which is, it seems as if the SEC are they wasting resources, right? So they're a regulatory agency, they work with a fixed budget, and that's taxpayer money. Are they wasting resources? Are they focusing too much on one set of firms and too little on other set of firms for no good reason, right? So they target misaligned firms more, but the misaligned firms are no different than other firms in their tendency to engage in misconduct. So we find evidence that sort of seems to hint in that direction. So we find that, even if you condition on the investigation itself, the firms that do get investigated, if a lot of them are going to be motivated by a partisan desire, then some of those investigations will be frivolous and will not meet the high bar for an enforcement action. So we find that, if you condition on investigation, the SEC is less likely to bring an enforcement action against a misaligned firm. Does that mean that they are then not even paying enough attention to these non-misaligned firms? So for that, we look at firms that have in fact engaged in misconduct. And then there again, we find that if you only look at firms that have engaged in misconduct, even there, misaligned firms are more likely to get investigated than other set of firms. So with about 5 minutes remaining, I'm going to go deeper into what kind of data we have to show you a little more flavor of what I've already described we're doing in this paper, right? So this is almost 20 years of data, more than 2,000 firms, more than 2,000 investigations, more than 800 enforcement actions. And, they say it takes a village to raise a child. It also takes a village to put together research like this. So a lot of people were also very helpful in helping us put together all of this data. So this may not come as a big surprise to a lot of people. More CEOs are Republican than Democrats. So our headline result is, if you just look at the rate at which firms get investigated, so the black bar you see is for the misaligned firms and the yellow bar is for the non-misaligned firms, the rate of investigation by the SEC against a misaligned firm is higher than the rate at which they investigate a non-misaligned firm. And this is true across most of the years in our sample. So this is not just a recent thing or an old thing. To put some numbers here, compared to an average firm, the rate at which an average firm in our sample gets investigated by the SEC, a politically misaligned firm gets investigated at a 16% higher rate. That's a pretty big number for almost no good reason, right? And as I said, again, these are within industry, within administration. So we are not allowing comparisons of firms across different administrations or across different industries. So we can basically remove a lot of these other explanations that might explain this behavior. We also find very similar result if for a smaller sample, we identify a CEO's party affiliation using the voter registration record. So if you're registered as a Republican or a Democrat, instead of who do you contribute money to, and we again find something very similar. The probability of receiving an enforcement action itself, which is the outcome of the investigation, that does not appear to be different. But the firms that do receive an enforcement action, the enforcement penalties are going to be more harsh against politically misaligned firms. So if you're a firm that identifies broadly with one party, and you receive an enforcement action from the SEC at a time when the SEC identifies with a different party, you're more likely to receive stronger penalties. And again, to put more flesh to this is more likely when the firms they sort of have a political leaning that is more likely to be visible to the outside world. So these are firms that are more in the news. So it's easier for outsiders to sort of figure out what their partisan leaning is. They also tend to be firms where both the CEO and the rest of the employees sort of end up contributing money to the same party. So there is more alignment within the firm. They're more homogenous in their partisan leaning within the firm. More partisan commissioners exhibit this behavior more in both investigations and penalties. Younger commissioners exhibit this behavior more in both investigations and penalty. In terms of career outcomes, what happens once they have done this behavior? Do they benefit from it later on in their career? And we're finding that they do. So the commissioners that oversee more partisan enforcement activities go on to have better careers even after their SEC tenure ends. And this applies to the staff as well. They are more likely to get promoted when they engage in such behavior. Almost like a reward, implicit reward for this behavior. These two types of firms are no different in who's going to engage in a misconduct. And that raises this important question, which is SEC wasting resources? Is this federal regulatory agency playing such a critical role in the US capital market? Are they wasting resources? So it seems as if there is some evidence that they are. They seem to be paying too much attention to one set of firms, and in turn paying too little attention to the other set of firms. So not only are they over investigating and paying too much attention to misaligned firms, they're also missing out on opportunities to investigate those in the other camp who are in fact engaging in misconduct. All of this is to say that based on our research, it seems as if one of the top financial regulators in the country, the SEC, exhibits partisan behavior in its investigation and enforcement activities. And it seems to suggest that there is misallocation of enforcement resources. Now, it has at least two implications. So I want to leave you with those two implications, and then I'll open this up for Q&A. So one is, of course, the fact that this is striking. SEC usually is seen as a very independent regulatory agency. So it's striking to see that even an agency as independent as the SEC gets influenced in one of the most critical actions that they take, their investigations and enforcement against financial misconduct. They appear to get influenced by partisan politics. And the other broader implication, if you zoom out of the SEC and just think about regulatory agencies more broadly, one of the implications from our research is that we should probably think again about political appointments at the top of regulatory agencies. So in our setting, we are finding that these political appointments seem to be influencing SEC's action in a way that is partisan. So if the goal is to have agencies that are less partisan, one implication is maybe to not have political appointments to lead federal regulatory agencies. Okay, with that, thank you so much for your attention. So I'm going to open this up to questions. I'm seeing questions filter in, and let's see if we can take a couple of them. So one question is how will history look at the current financial situation in the US? I mean, the first is the more philosophical answer. I mean, I think it's always easier to look back than to look forward. So my scientific answer is I don't know. What I can say is that having seen the data for the last almost 20 years, it seems as if an agency which the biggest capital market in the world places a lot of trust in has probably been engaging in a way that doesn't seem right, to the extent that the goal is to have an independent agency that treats firms in a neutral way. And it just so happens that party affiliation has become, or in fact, looking at our data, has been for the last 20 years an important factor that seems to be influencing an important behavior of one of the most important regulators, not only in the US, but in the rest of the world. So that's concerning. What does that mean for the future? I don't know. I mean, my hope is that maybe our research and others who are thinking about this will help make the agencies more independent and more fair to other market participants. Um, let me pick up a couple more questions. Okay, so how should investors assess the regulatory risk as part of their portfolio strategy and corporate governance evaluations? So that's a fantastic one. Before we think about the investors, I think one important agent we should think about is people working in the industry. So whether it's the CEO or top management, middle management, somebody just entering the workforce. What does it mean? So if you think about the way we are measuring what this firm's political leaning is, we're looking at the CEO's party, right? And we're finding that when the CEO's party is different from the SEC's party, the firm becomes a target. One implication would be to stay neutral. And again, this is not to say that behaving in a partisan way within your firm does not have its own benefits. It can have its own benefits, right? It could probably be, because if you think about party, what is a party? A party is essentially sort of a summary statistic or a summary that summarizes sort of what type of things you believe in. And that's one way in which parties split people. What do I believe in? And a set of things that I believe in together might become part of one party versus what somebody else might collectively believe in. That becomes part of the identity of a different party. Having this known to the rest of the world seems to suggest that you're more likely to be a target. And so maybe let's not ignore the cost. While there could be benefits of having a partisan leaning for the corporate America, we've identified a cost, and the cost is that if your partisan leaning is more known to the rest of the world, you're more likely to become a target, irrespective of administrations and time periods and industries. And then you can roll that up to what does that mean for investors? Let me take a couple more questions. Politically informed preferential treatment. Have we found evidence suggesting that politically aligned firms receive preferential treatment or reduced enforcement? Okay, so um, my guess is, so I'm going to modify the question just a little bit. Is it preferential treatment to your own kind or worse treatment to a different kind? Do you love your own people a lot more and are indifferent to the other group, or you're indifferent to your own but you really hate the other group a lot more? Sort of, if we step back from our research question and more broadly frame this as, is it giving favor to one, or is it really being extra harsh on the other? That's always very difficult to say. All we can say is we can compare the two and say that one is different than the other. We don't know what the benchmark truly is other than one compared to the other. So there is a difference between the two. One way to interpret that is there is a preferential treatment to the aligned group. Another way to interpret that is there is worse treatment to the misaligned group. If there was a normative benchmark of what the treatment should look like, to that we could compare the two treatments and see if this is really preference for one or really just hatred for the other. We don't know. All we can say is one is different than the other. Is it different between Republicans and Democrats? Not really. It's we've found this for the last 20 years, and it's true across um, administrations and across years. So it's not really one party behavior. I can take one more question if there is one. Let me see. So I think I answered this one. So this is a good one. Whether it's the SEC or other regulatory agencies, does a behavior like this, which shifts with administration, and one set of firms suddenly get targeted and then the other set of firms maybe receive favorable treatment, and this can shift with changing political climate, does that increase the uncertainty? I think it does. And I'm not saying this by backing it up with a research that I have personally done, but just thinking more broadly about firms do want to think about regulatory risk. And I think one of the implications of our study is that maybe this is a regulatory risk that firms should be thinking about and incorporating this into their decisions. And multinationals operate in so many different regimes that it becomes even more complicated for them how to play in a way across markets that they don't become what they would call unfair targets of regulators in uh, certain markets. That's a risk, and they should be, I think, actively thinking about this 100%. But I want to emphasize that this is not new behavior. I think this has been around, but it's possible that it has not caught the attention of corporate America, and maybe it should. So we are at the 30-minute mark. I don't want to go over time. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was fantastic. I learned a lot from your questions, and again, thinking about these issues and diving deeper into our research one more time. I hope to see you some other time. Thank you so much. Your questions were fantastic, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.